started on a cold Monday morning in downtown Tokyo, the kind of morning where the city hummed with quiet ambition. The glass towers shimmered against a pale gray sky, and people rushed to their offices with coffee cups in hand, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors of the business district. Inside one of those towers, specifically the top floor of Takahashi Global Industries, a small crowd had gathered for a meeting that, at first glance, looked ordinary. No one could have known that within a few minutes, a moment of arrogance and humiliation would turn into something that would make headlines across the world. The office belonged to Arthur Langston, an American billionaire known for his ruthless business style and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. At 54, he had built an empire out of tech investments and global partnerships, and he liked to remind everyone that he was the reason the company stood where it did. Arthur had recently moved the company's operations to Tokyo, a move many saw as bold and others as foolish. He didn't care either way. He liked the challenge, the sense of dominance that came from being a foreigner commanding respect in one of the world's most disciplined cities. His mornings were a ritual. He'd enter his office precisely at 8:30, toss his expensive leather briefcase on the desk, and expect his assistant to have already prepared his black coffee. He hated sugar. Sweetness, he often said, was for people who hadn't worked hard enough to taste bitterness. That morning, though, something felt slightly off. His new translator hadn't arrived yet. Across the city, in a smaller apartment with paper-thin walls and flickering lights, a young woman named Amara Lewis was getting ready for what she hoped would be a life-changing interview. She was 23, born in Atlanta, and had moved to Japan 3 years earlier after earning a scholarship to study linguistics. Her passion had always been languages. She could hear sounds most people missed, could catch rhythm in speech like it was music. Japanese had been the hardest to learn, but she'd done it anyway, spending long nights practicing pronunciation and memorizing kanji while working part-time at a cafe. Her mother, back in Georgia, worked 2 jobs, always telling her, "Baby, you gotta go where they don't expect you to be and make them remember your name." Those words played in her mind as she tied her hair back and looked in the mirror. She wasn't rich. She didn't have connections, but she had skill and a quiet, growing confidence that she was worth more than people often assumed when they looked at her. By 10 a.m., Amara walked into the Takahashi building for her interview. The lobby gleamed with white marble and glass sculptures that looked too expensive to touch. Everyone who passed her wore suits and spoke with the clipped precision of people who'd been trained never to waste time. When she introduced herself at the reception, the woman barely looked up. "You're here for the assistant position?" she asked flatly, her Japanese crisp and fast. Amara nodded, switching languages mid-sentence. "Yes, that's correct. I'm here to see Mr. Langston." The receptionist blinked, surprised. "Oh, you speak Japanese." Amara smiled politely. "A little," she said, though in truth her Japanese was nearly fluent. She followed the woman's directions to the elevator, her heart thudding. She knew how this worked, how people looked at her and made assumptions. She felt it before, the looks that said you don't belong here. But she also knew what she could do, and that gave her a quiet power. Upstairs, Arthur Langston was packing his office. "Where's the interpreter?" he asked his assistant sharply. "We've got partners from Osaka coming in 20 minutes, and I can't afford another screw-up." "She's on her way, sir," the assistant replied nervously. "A candidate from the university, Amara Lewis." Arthur's expression changed slightly. "Lewis," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound Japanese." "She's American, sir." Arthur sighed. "Of course she is." He didn't bother hiding his irritation. "Let's hope she's better than the last one. I can't keep hearing people who can't even translate properly." When Amara entered the room, the tension was thick enough to feel. Arthur barely looked up from his laptop. "You're late," he said coldly, even though she was. "It's 9:57, she replied quietly, glancing at the wall clock. He looked up then, his eyes narrowing. "You're precise, I like that." His voice softened only slightly. "Sit down." The meeting that followed was strange. Arthur questioned her like he was testing more than her qualifications, like he was measuring her worth as a person. "You studied at Tokyo University?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "And you speak Japanese fluently?" "I do." He leaned back in his chair. "Translate this for me," he said, smirking slightly as he spoke in fast, business-level Japanese, a tongue twister filled with technical terms. It was a trap, a test she wasn't meant to pass. Amara waited for him to finish, then calmly repeated his words back in perfect Japanese, her tone professional and her accent precise. For a moment the room went still. Arthur blinked, almost offended by her fluency. "Not bad," he said finally, forcing a laugh. "Looks like you've been studying hard. I'll tell you what, translate this next part and maybe I'll give your mom my job." The words came out like a joke, but there was a sharpness in them, something cruel beneath the laughter. The others in the room chuckled awkwardly. They didn't know where to look. Amara's jaw tightened slightly. She could have ignored it. She could have smiled like so many had done before her. But she didn't. She looked him straight in the eyes and spoke in Japanese, slow and deliberate. "I think your mother would be proud if you spoke even half as well as she raised you." The room fell silent. Arthur froze. The translator sitting in the corner looked from one to the other, unsure if she'd heard right. But the Osaka partners, 3 elderly businessmen, burst into quiet laughter, the kind of laughter that fills the air when someone powerful has just been humbled. Arthur's face flushed red. For the first time that morning, he didn't know what to say. That moment, small as it was, would become the spark that set everything else in motion. What started as a simple interview, a careless insult, a young woman's calm response, would soon turn into something much darker, because people like Arthur Langston didn't forgive humiliation, especially not when it came from someone the world never expected to challenge him. And while the world outside continued as usual, cars honking, screens flashing, and workers moving like clockwork, something inside that building had shifted. A crack had formed in the glass tower, invisible but deep, and in time it would shatter everything. After that day, things began to change inside Takahashi Global Industries. At first, no one said anything about the moment that had silenced the room, but people whispered. It spread quietly like smoke finding cracks in a wall. "Did you hear what the new girl said?" She talked back to Langston. In Japanese. The story twisted as it passed from person to person. Some said she embarrassed him on purpose, others said he was just being cruel. But no matter how it was told, one fact remained. Arthur Langston, the man who no one dared to challenge, had been put in his place by a young black woman. Amara didn't think much of it at first. She'd gotten the job. Arthur had hired her on the spot, his tone light but his expression unreadable. "You're sharp," he had said. "I like sharp people, they make things interesting." She thought it was a compliment at the time. Later, she realized it was a warning. The first few weeks were calm, almost too calm. Arthur treated her professionally, giving her small tasks, drafting translation notes, sitting in on calls, reviewing contracts written in Japanese. She worked quietly, efficiently, earning the quiet respect of others in the office. Even the Japanese board members began trusting her more than they did Arthur's longtime assistants because she listened, really listened. But behind closed doors, Arthur's attitude toward her began to shift. It started with little comments. "You're not like most people," he'd say, smiling faintly. "You've got this stubbornness, I like that." Or sometimes, "You're too serious, Amara, loosen up a little, people might think you're trying to prove something." She'd nod politely, laugh when appropriate, and then return to work. But she could feel the tension growing, like a string slowly tightening. The office itself had its own hierarchy, a silent system where everyone knew their place. The Japanese employees worked with quiet precision, rarely questioning authority. The foreigners, mostly Americans or Europeans, spoke louder, joked more, and often treated their local coworkers like background noise. Amara existed somewhere between the two worlds, too foreign to fully blend in, too different to be accepted by the Americans who dominated the upper floors. Still, she did her job perfectly. That alone was enough to make enemies. The first open act of hostility came from Clara Monroe, Arthur's longtime executive assistant. Clara had been with him for almost 10 years, a tall, polished woman in her 40s who handled his schedule, his calls, even his moods. She was fiercely loyal, but there was something colder about that loyalty. It came from fear, not respect. Clara saw Amara as a threat from the beginning. "He likes you," she said one day during lunch, her tone sharp despite the smile. "You should be careful. Mr. Langston doesn't like being challenged, especially by someone new." "I don't plan on challenging him," Amara replied quietly. Clara smirked. "You already did." From then on, small things began to happen. Files went missing. Emails Amara had sent were mysteriously deleted or never received. Once, Arthur accused her of forgetting to translate a document that Clara had intentionally removed from her desk. When Amara tried to explain, he cut her off. "You're responsible for your own mistakes," he said flatly. The words stung. She'd done nothing wrong, but she could tell he wanted her to take the blame anyway. Power games. That's what this was. A reminder that no matter how smart or fluent she was, he was still the one in control. At night, she'd go home to her small apartment and try to let it go. But her mind wouldn't stop replaying every word, every look. She'd think about her mother, how she used to say, when people can't control you, they'll try to control the way others see you. And she realized that's exactly what Arthur was doing. Slowly, quietly, he was shaping how people in the office saw her. Then came the Osaka conference. It was a big event, a chance for the company to secure a major partnership that could boost its profits for years. Arthur was under pressure. The investors wanted results, and his reputation was already fragile after several bad deals in the States. Everyone could feel his stress. Amara had been asked to join the trip as his interpreter. She didn't want to go, something about it made her uneasy, but refusing wasn't an option. The flight to Osaka was quiet. Arthur barely spoke to her. But during the meetings, he relied on her constantly. She translated every conversation perfectly, smoothed over cultural misunderstandings, and even caught an error in one of the contract drafts that could have cost the company millions. That night after the final meeting, the team celebrated in a private restaurant. Arthur ordered expensive steak, his mood suddenly lighter. He started complimenting her in front of everyone. "This girl," he said, raising his glass, "is the reason we're walking away with this deal." Everyone clapped. Amara smiled politely but didn't drink much. She could tell his praise wasn't about her. It was about showing off his generosity, his ability to discover talent. When the dinner ended, most people left. Arthur stayed behind. "Walk with me," he said, his tone casual but firm. They stepped outside into the quiet Osaka streets, lights glowing softly through the mist. He spoke about ambition, about loyalty, about how people only succeed if they're willing to play the game. Then he looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You embarrassed me once," he said quietly, "in front of my team, but I forgave you. You know why?" Amara didn't respond. "Because you remind me of myself," he continued. "Hungry, smart, you know what you want. That's rare. Don't waste it by thinking you're better than the people who can help you." She felt a chill go through her. His words sounded like advice, but the tone, low, almost intimate, felt like a threat wrapped in flattery. She excused herself soon after, claiming exhaustion. That night, she barely slept. When they returned to Tokyo, things only got worse. Arthur's behavior became unpredictable. One day, he'd praise her in front of everyone. The next, he'd humiliate her over small mistakes. Once, he made her read a report in front of the entire department, then interrupted halfway through to say, "You sound too emotional. Try to sound more professional, less personal." The room went silent. Everyone understood what he meant. Outside of work, Amara started noticing strange things. A black car parked near her apartment more than once. Anonymous emails warned her to stay in her place. At first, she thought she was being paranoid, but one night she came home to find her front door slightly open. Nothing was stolen, but her drawers had been rummaged through. She reported it to the police, but they didn't take it seriously. "Probably just a mistake," the officer said. "You must have left it unlocked." Her mother's voice echoed in her mind again. "They'll try to scare you before they destroy you." At the same time, Arthur's personal life began to unravel. News spread that his wife, back in New York, had filed for divorce, accusing him of infidelity and emotional cruelty. The media picked it up, calling him the ruthless billionaire and digging into his past. Old scandals resurfaced, allegations of harassment, shady business deals, and partners who mysteriously disappeared from contracts. Arthur grew more irritable, more paranoid. He started coming into the office late, smelling of whiskey. He'd call Amara into his office at odd hours, demanding she stay late for urgent work. When she refused one night, he stared at her with cold fury. "Do you know how many people would kill for this job?" "I'm not one of them," she said softly. That was the moment something broke between them. From then on, every encounter felt charged with danger, unspoken but real. He began to undermine her openly, questioning her translations, assigning her impossible deadlines, and accusing her of being too emotional for corporate work. And then a rumor started spreading. Someone claimed Amara had been leaking internal documents to a rival company. No one knew who started it, but Clara seemed to know too much about it too soon. Within a week, Amara's name was being whispered again in the hallways, this time not as the girl who stood up to Langston, but as the one who might bring him down. Desperate to defend herself, she gathered evidence, emails, recordings, proof that Clara had tampered with files. When she finally confronted Arthur with it, his face went pale. For the first time, he didn't have an answer ready. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. "You don't understand how this world works." But she did understand. She just wasn't willing to play by his rules anymore. 2 days later, she was suspended pending investigation. Her work laptop was taken, her ID revoked. Security escorted her out of the building while employees pretended not to look. Arthur watched from his glass office window, his reflection ghostly in the morning light. That night, Arthur's assistant found him alone in his office, staring out over the city. "She's gone," Clara said quietly. He didn't respond, but something in his eyes had changed, something cold, dark, and restless. And though no one knew it yet, the story was far from over. Because when power, pride, and humiliation collide, it never ends quietly. It ends with something breaking, someone breaking, and when that happens, there's no going back. It happened on a Friday night, one of those nights when Tokyo's skyline looked almost unreal, neon lights reflecting off glass, the air heavy with the smell of rain. Inside the towering Takahashi building, most of the offices were dark except for the top floor. Arthur Langston was still there, packing, his desk littered with half-empty glasses and scattered documents. The storm outside mirrored the one inside him. He'd just received an email that made his blood boil. Amara Lewis had filed an official complaint with the company's ethics board, nomming him for harassment, manipulation, and professional sabotage. For a man like Arthur, public humiliation was death. Power was all he had left. His wife had left him, his investors were nervous, and now the one person who had already humiliated him once was threatening to do it again, but this time on paper in front of the world. Downstairs in the lobby, Amara stood holding a file folder. Her heart pounded, but her steps were steady. She wasn't there to beg or apologize. She'd been called in by HR to collect her remaining documents before her suspension became permanent. She wanted closure, something clean, something that would let her finally walk away. When the elevator doors opened onto the top floor, the lights flickered. The hallway was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant roll of thunder. Arthur's office door was slightly open, golden light spilling through the gap. She knocked once, hesitated, then stepped inside. Arthur looked up slowly. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie loosened. "Well," he said, his voice heavy with sarcasm, "if it isn't the woman who wants to destroy me." "I came for my things," she said, her tone calm but guarded. He laughed, but it wasn't amusement. It was the kind of laugh that comes from exhaustion and rage mixed together. "You think you're brave," he muttered. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you, standing up to the big bad man?" She didn't respond. She walked to her desk, gathered a few papers, and slid them into her folder. He watched her closely, his hand tightening around a glass of whiskey. "You don't get it, do you?" he said suddenly, slamming the glass down so hard that amber liquid splashed across the desk. "Everything you have here, every chance you got, it was because of me. You think you'd even be standing in this building if I hadn't given you a shot?" She turned to face him. "You didn't give me anything," she said softly. "I earned it, and that's what makes you angry." The words hit him harder than any insult could. His jaw clenched. He took a slow step forward, his voice dropping. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" "I told the truth," she replied. "The truth," he laughed again, louder this time. "You're going to ruin a man's life because your pride got hurt." Her hands trembled, but she stood her ground. "You ruined your own life, Arthur." The silence that followed was sharp. The rain began to tap against the glass windows, the sound filling the space like ticking clock hands. Arthur's breathing grew uneven. He moved closer until he was only a few feet away. "You think they'll believe you?" he whispered. "You think anyone going to take your word over mine?" "I don't care if they do," she said quietly. "I just need to stop pretending this is okay." Something inside him snapped. The glass paperweight on his desk, a heavy crystal globe, caught his eye. He reached for it without thinking. His mind blurred, fueled by humiliation, anger, and the need to feel powerful again. Amara took a step back, sensing the shift. "Arthur, put it down," she said, her voice shaking. He didn't, his voice dropped to a whisper. "You shouldn't have crossed me." Then he swung. The sound was sharp, horrifying. The globe hit her temple and she stumbled backward, crashing into the edge of the desk. Papers flew into the air, her folder fell open, and the room exploded into chaos. For a second, Arthur froze, the paperweight still in his hand, his chest heaving. He hadn't meant to, at least that's what he told himself in that frozen second. But when she fell, when her head hit the corner of the desk, and when the blood began to spread across the floor, Something primal inside him took over. "No, no, no," he muttered, dropping the paperweight. He knelt beside her, his hands shaking. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Then her body went still. Arthur stared at her, panic clawing its way up his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard it hurt. He pressed his hands to his head, packing in circles. "It was an accident," he whispered to himself. "She fell. She hit her head, that's all." But when he looked down at his hands, there was blood on them, bright, unmistakable red. The storm outside grew louder. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene, the shattered glass, the overturned chair, the smear of blood on the floor. His reflection in the window looked like a stranger's. He moved quickly then, his mind switching from panic to survival. He grabbed a cloth from his desk drawer, wiped his hands, and began packing again. "Think," he whispered. "Think." He looked around the room, searching for something, anything to make this go away. He spotted her folder on the floor, documents scattered, a printed copy of the complaint letter lying on top. He picked it up, staring at her name typed neatly at the top, Amara Lewis v. Arthur Langston, his name beside hers. The sight made him tremble. He tore the papers into pieces, shoving them into the fireplace at the corner of the office. The flames swallowed the evidence, curling the edges of the paper into black ash. But no amount of fire could erase what had just happened. He thought about calling security, calling an ambulance, but what would he say? "I hit her. I didn't mean it." He knew how fast stories spread. The board would hear, the press would know, everything he built would fall apart. Minutes passed, then an hour. The rain didn't stop. The city outside glowed as if unaware that a life had just ended inside one of its tallest towers. Finally, Arthur made a decision. He wrapped her body in his jacket and dragged it toward the private elevator at the back of his office, a service lift meant for maintenance workers. His movements were mechanical, almost detached, as if he were watching himself from far away. When the elevator doors opened, he stared at his reflection again. His hair was wet with sweat, his face pale. "It's not murder," he whispered. "It's an accident." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He rode the elevator down to the underground parking level. The garage was empty, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. He opened the trunk of his black sedan and laid her inside as gently as he could. Her hand slipped free, and for a moment he couldn't bring himself to move it. He just stared at her face, peaceful now, too quiet, and for the first time in years he felt something close to guilt. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "You shouldn't have pushed me." His voice cracked. He slammed the trunk shut. By the time he drove out into the storm, the rain had washed away most of the blood from his shoes, but not all of it. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. He didn't have a plan yet, just a direction, north, toward the countryside where no one knew him. Every light, every passing car made his pulse race. He stopped finally near the edge of the woods outside Tokyo, a place he'd once visited on a company retreat. The road was empty, the air heavy with mist. He got out, opened the trunk again, and stood there in the rain. For a moment it looked like he might fall to his knees, but instead he moved quickly, digging with a tire iron until his hands were blistered and shaking. When he was done, he laid her in the shallow pit and covered her with dirt, mud clinging to his clothes and hair. When it was over, he stood in the darkness, soaked to the bone, staring at the ground. His breath came in short gasps. "No one will ever know," he whispered to himself. "No one will ever know." But the truth never stays buried. Even as he drove away, headlights cutting through the fog, the weight in his chest grew heavier. Every reflection in the windshield looked like her face. Every sound in the rain sounded like her voice. He thought he could silence her by ending her life, but all he did was give her a louder one that would soon echo through every corner of his perfect empire. And when the morning came, and the cleaning crew found the streaks of blood still staining the edge of his desk, it was already too late. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the city gray and heavy with silence. The world outside went on as usual. Subway cars crowded, coffee shops opened, and workers hurried through the streets. But for Arthur Langston, time had stopped completely. He sat in his penthouse apartment, staring at the skyline with bloodshot eyes and an untouched drink in his hand. His suit was still damp from the night before. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Amara's eyes half open, her voice faint, her body still. He kept telling himself it wasn't his fault. It was an accident. She slipped. She hit her head. He didn't mean to, but even as he repeated it in his mind, his chest tightened. The words felt hollow. By mid-morning, his assistant Clara knocked on his door. He opened it slowly, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "You're late," he said weakly, though she was. She studied his face and frowned. "You look awful, what happened?" "Nothing," he said quickly, "just a long night." But Clara noticed the tremor in his hand, the faint smell of rain and soil clinging to his clothes. She didn't ask questions, not yet. She worked for him long enough to recognize when something was wrong. Still, the company had a problem. No one had heard from Amara since the night before. She hadn't gone home. Her phone was off. Her mother in the U.S. had already called the HR department after Amara failed to answer her texts. Arthur froze when he overheard Clara on the phone later that day, telling HR, yes, she was supposed to come in last night to pick up her things. No one's seen her since. The room began to spin. His throat went dry. "What did you just say?" Clara turned. "They're looking for her. Maybe she stayed with a friend." He forced himself to nod. Maybe. That night the guilt hit him like a storm. He couldn't eat. He couldn't focus. He paced his living room until dawn, replaying every second of what happened. He told himself he buried her deep enough, far enough. No one would find her. But his mind betrayed him. Flashes of her face, her final words, the weight of her body as he carried her to the car. Every sound in his apartment made him jump. 2 days later, Amara's disappearance became official. Her friends filed a missing person report. The police began interviewing coworkers. News outlets picked it up by the end of the week. American linguist missing in Tokyo, last seen at Takahashi Global offices. Her photo was everywhere, smiling, bright-eyed, wearing a soft yellow sweater. Arthur's company tried to control the story. They issued a short statement. "We are deeply concerned about the disappearance of one of our employees and are cooperating fully with authorities." But inside the office, whispers started again. Some said she'd been kidnapped. Others said she'd fled Japan after leaking confidential documents. Only a few quietly wondered if something darker had happened inside those glass walls. Arthur went to work as usual, trying to look calm. He wore a new suit, shaved, and forced his smile back into place. But his eyes gave him away. He was restless, snappish, and easily angered. Clara noticed. "You're not yourself," she told him one morning. He didn't answer. Behind the scenes, the police were beginning to ask questions. They reviewed security footage from the Takahashi building. One camera caught Amara entering the elevator around 8:45 p.m. that night, but she never came back down. The private elevator that led directly to Arthur's office showed no outward movement. Still, the time logs indicated it had been used between 9:00 and 9:20. When investigators asked Arthur about it, he claimed he'd been working late alone and hadn't seen her. But one small thing betrayed him, the faint bloodstain they found on the corner of his office carpet. He said he'd cut his hand opening a package. They took samples anyway. Meanwhile, across the city, Amara's absence weighed heavily on the few people who truly cared about her. Her friend Yumi from the cafe cried when the police showed her Amara's picture. She was happy, she said. She talked about going home to visit her mom. She wasn't running from anything. Her mother's voice trembled through the news broadcast. "My baby worked so hard to make something of herself," she said from Atlanta. She loved Japan. She believed in people being fair even when they weren't to her. "Please, if anyone knows anything." The plea reached millions. Social media exploded with posts demanding answers. The hashtag Justice for Amara trended worldwide. Old clips of her speaking fluent Japanese in interviews surfaced online, and people called her the voice of resilience. To the public, she became a symbol of talent crushed by power. Arthur tried to stay composed, but his empire began to crack. Investors pulled out quietly. Clients canceled meetings. The press surrounded his office building. His name appeared in online forums under words like abuser and predator. At home, he began to unravel. He stopped eating. He barely slept. Every night he dreamed of the forest, the sound of rain on leaves, the thud of the shovel against wet earth. Once he woke up convinced he heard her voice whispering his name from the corner of the room. Clara confronted him one evening after work. "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice shaking. "Did you see her that night?" Arthur froze. "Why are you asking that?" "Because you're lying," she said. "You've been lying since the day she disappeared. You look haunted." He stared at her for a long time, then his expression softened. "You wouldn't understand," he said quietly. "Try me." He opened his mouth but stopped. His throat felt tight. He wanted to confess, to release the weight crushing him, but the fear of losing everything was stronger. Instead, he turned away. "Drop it, Clara," he said. "That's an order." The next morning, police arrived with a search warrant. They combed through his office, his car, and finally his apartment. He watched silently as they lifted his belongings, photographed his walls, and took his shoes. One of the officers noticed mud traces on the soles, the same reddish-brown soil found near the forest outside Tokyo. Arthur tried to explain it away. "I go jogging there sometimes," he said, "to clear my head." But his calm started to fracture. His voice wavered, his hands shook. The detectives exchanged glances. 3 days later, hikers near the edge of that same forest called the police after their dog dug up what looked like human remains. The body was badly decomposed from the rain, but the jewelry, a small gold bracelet engraved with the word faith, was still there. It was Amara's. The discovery made global news. The headlines were brutal. "Body of missing translator found, billionaire CEO under investigation." The world that once admired Arthur Langston now turned against him completely. He was arrested the same night, led out of his penthouse in handcuffs while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. His face was pale, his expression hollow. He didn't speak. Not when the officers read him his rights, not when Clara looked at him from across the hall with tears in her eyes. In the interrogation room, he sat under the harsh light for hours. When the detective placed a photo of Amara's bracelet on the table, his hands began to shake uncontrollably. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to kill her." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution painted him as a man consumed by ego, power, and rage, a man who couldn't handle being challenged by someone he saw as beneath him. The defense tried to argue it was an accident, that he acted in the heat of the moment. But the evidence was clear, and so was his guilt. The verdict came on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Guilty of manslaughter and concealment of a body. 25 years in prison. Arthur didn't react. He just sat there staring straight ahead. His empire was gone. His name, once synonymous with success, was now a warning, a reminder of what power without conscience becomes. As for Amara, she was buried back home in Georgia. Her mother stood by her grave beneath the oak trees, clutching a folded letter that Amara had once written but never sent. It read, "No matter what happens, I want to believe that truth always finds its way." And it had. But the truth came at a cost, one that left an entire city stunned, a mother broken, and a man who had everything left with nothing but silence and regret. When the final verdict echoed through the courtroom, it felt less like a resolution and more like the closing of a long, haunted chapter. Arthur Langston, once celebrated as one of Tokyo's most influential foreign CEOs, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The cameras outside flashed like gunfire as the officers led him away. He didn't resist, didn't protest. The man who had built an empire of confidence and control now moved with the quiet resignation of someone who had finally been stripped bare. For many watching, it felt like justice, at least on paper. The headlines read, "Justice for Amara, Langston sentenced," and power no longer a shield. But beneath the surface, the victory was bittersweet. Justice could punish a man, yes, but it couldn't bring Amara back, couldn't undo the terror of that night, couldn't erase the years of silenced fear and unspoken imbalance that had led to it. Amara's mother sat in the courtroom's front row, clutching a photo of her daughter as the judge read the sentence. Her hands trembled, but her face was calm. She didn't cry. She had cried for months already, through every hearing, every news broadcast, every hateful comment from strangers who had tried to paint her daughter as complicit in her own tragedy. When the gavel fell, she whispered, "It's done." But the truth was, it would never really be done. In the weeks that followed, Arthur's company dissolved. Board members resigned one by one. The brand he'd spent 20 years building became a stain, its name forever linked to corruption, violence, and exploitation. Former employees spoke out about the toxic culture he'd fostered, the intimidation, the gaslighting, the silent pressure to obey. Stories that had once been whispered in office corridors were now splashed across global news feeds. Meanwhile, in the prison yard, Arthur was no longer the man who had once commanded rooms with a word. He kept to himself, reading old business journals and staring out at the horizon beyond the walls. He had time, too much time, to think about what he'd done, about what he'd destroyed. He often replayed the last moment before it all fell apart, the moment Amara said no. For the first time, he began to understand that the real tragedy wasn't just the loss of her life, but the rot that had consumed him long before that night. The arrogance, the entitlement, the belief that he could take and silence and erase without consequence. Prison didn't make him remorseful, it made him see. And in that seeing he found the faintest trace of what he'd never allowed himself before: shame. Across the ocean, Amara's grave became a quiet place of pilgrimage. Her friends and former students left flowers, language books, and notes written in English and Japanese. A scholarship was established in her name, the Amara T. Foundation for Women in Language and Diplomacy. Her mother poured her grief into advocacy, speaking at universities about workplace harassment and the dangers of unchecked power. "Justice," she said during one televised interview, "isn't just a sentence. It's the courage to change what allowed this to happen." And slowly, the case did change things. In Japan and abroad, corporations began reviewing their internal policies on harassment and power abuse. Women started coming forward in industries once ruled by silence. The story of Arthur and Amara became more than just a crime. It became a mirror. It reflected how easily society forgives the powerful, how charm and wealth can blind people to cruelty, how a woman's resistance can be twisted into defiance, and how her suffering can be reduced to a headline. But it also reflected something else, something painful yet hopeful. That truth, no matter how deeply buried, finds a way to surface. Clara, the assistant who had once admired Arthur, left Tokyo soon after the trial. She couldn't bear to stay in the same city that still bore his shadow. She moved to Singapore, where she began working for a nonprofit focused on corporate accountability. She carried with her the guilt of not speaking up sooner, but also a new sense of purpose. "I used to believe loyalty meant silence," she told a journalist. "Now I know loyalty to truth is the only kind that matters." Back in Japan, detectives who had worked the case were honored for their persistence. The lead investigator, Inspector Yamamoto, later said in an interview, "We didn't solve this case because of luck. We solved it because people refused to stop asking questions." As time passed, public fascination with the case waned, but its echoes remained. University lectures cited it as a defining example of corporate abuse and moral decay. Filmmakers and authors reinterpreted it as a modern parable about ambition, guilt, and consequence. For some, Arthur's downfall was a tragedy, a brilliant mind destroyed by ego. For others, it was justice long overdue. In a quiet moment years later, Arthur wrote a letter from prison. It was addressed to Amara's mother, though he never sent it. In it, he wrote, "I wanted power because I thought it made me untouchable. But power doesn't erase what you are, it only magnifies it. I see now that I was never strong. I was terrified. Terrified of losing control, terrified of being seen for what I really was. I can't ask for forgiveness. I just want you to know that I finally see her, not as someone beneath me, but as someone better." The letter was found among his belongings after his death, 10 years into his sentence. In the end, there were no heroes in this story, only broken people and the lessons they left behind. Arthur's empire was gone. Amara's life was stolen, yet her voice, through her writing, her work, and the legacy she inspired, endured. She became in death what she had always wanted to be in life, heard. The case forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about gender, privilege, and morality. It asked the world to look inward and question how many other Arthur Langstons walked freely in boardrooms, protected by silence and success. Justice, it turned out, wasn't a clean word. It was messy, imperfect, human, but it was real. And somewhere beneath the quiet rustle of trees in a forest where her body was once hidden, the earth seemed to have reclaimed her with tenderness. The leaves whispered not of tragedy, but of endurance, of a story that refused to stay buried. Because in the end, that was Amara's final victory. The truth lived on,